Let me ask you something honest. Have you ever opened an investing app? Maybe you downloaded it at like 11 at night because you were lying in bed feeling behind, and then just closed it without doing anything. Because the moment you got in there, it felt like everyone else already knew something you didn't. I've been there, and what's interesting is that feeling, that freeze, it's not laziness. It's not stupidity. It's actually a very specific psychological response to overwhelm mixed with shame. And nobody talks about that part. Because when you're starting from zero, not from, I have $1,000 and I'm figuring out index funds, but from actual zero, maybe even a little in the negative, the financial world doesn't feel like it's speaking to you. It feels like it's speaking around you. And at some point, you just quietly decided to tune it out until you felt more ready. This video is for that version of you, the one who isn't ready but is watching anyway. Here's the thing most financial content gets wrong. It assumes you have a starting point. It assumes you already understand what a brokerage is, that you have a little cushion, that your stress about money is mostly about optimization. Like, should I do a Roth or a traditional IRA? Should I pick ETFs or index funds? Those are genuinely useful questions, but they're the wrong first questions. Because if you're starting from zero, your first obstacle isn't information. It's trust. Trust that any of this is actually possible for someone in your situation. Trust that the system isn't designed in a way that quietly excludes you. And honestly, trust that you're not too far behind to matter. The financial industry has this quiet assumption baked into almost everything it produces, that the person consuming it already has some stability, a job that covers the basics. No credit card debt keeping them up at night. Maybe a parent who explained what a 401k was at some point. And if that's not you, if you grew up in a house where money was either scarce or just never discussed, then you're not behind because you failed at something. You're behind because nobody handed you the same map that other people quietly received. That's not a personal failure. That's just the reality of how financial literacy gets passed down, or doesn't. So before we talk about investing, before we talk about any of the mechanics, I want to just sit in that truth for a second. Because the shame around not knowing this stuff is actually one of the biggest barriers to starting, and if we don't name it, it just keeps operating in the background. Okay, so let's actually talk about what investing is. Not in the textbook way. In the human way, investing at its core is the act of putting money somewhere so that it can grow over time without you having to actively work for that growth. That's it. That's the whole concept. When you work a job, you trade hours for money. The moment you stop working, the money stops coming. Investing flips that relationship. You put money into something, a company, a fund, a piece of property, and that something works on your behalf, ideally growing while you sleep. Now, why does this feel inaccessible to most people? Because the tools used to invest, the apps, the accounts, the language, all feel designed for people who already have money. And there's some truth to that. Historically, investing was literally only available to the wealthy. You needed a broker. You needed connections. You needed minimum balances that most people couldn't reach. But something shifted in the last decade or so. The barriers got dramatically lower. You can now open a brokerage account with $0 and buy a small fraction of a diversified fund for less than the cost of a coffee. That's genuinely new. That's not how it worked for most of history. So the mechanics have changed. But the psychology hasn't caught up. Most people who grew up without money around investing still carry this internal belief that it's not for people like me. And that belief is more powerful than any app or low minimum requirement, because you can technically have access to something and still psychologically wall yourself off from it. Let me explain how the actual growth works, though, because I think this is where the magic is, and also where most explanations lose people. There's a concept called compound growth. And I know you've probably heard of compound interest before, and maybe it felt abstract. But let me make it concrete. Say you put a small amount of money into an investment, let's say a broad market index fund, which is basically a basket of hundreds of different companies, all bundled together, so you're not betting on any one company. That fund, historically, has grown at an average of somewhere around 7 to 10% per year, depending on which one and over what period. That number isn't guaranteed. Markets go up and down. But over long stretches of time, like decades, the direction has historically been upward. Now, here's what compound growth actually means. That growth doesn't just apply to your original amount. It applies to your original amount plus all the growth you've already earned. So the number compounds on itself. The longer it goes, the faster it builds. Not because you're adding more, but because the base keeps getting bigger. This is why people always say start early, not to stress you out, but because time is literally the engine, and the cruel irony is that the people who need the most time, the ones who are starting with the least, are often the ones who wait the longest because they feel unqualified. The other thing I want to name here is risk, because this is where a lot of people either get exploited or just get scared into doing nothing. Investing in the stock market involves risk. Prices go down, sometimes a lot. There have been periods, 2008 is the obvious one, early 2020 is another, where the market dropped dramatically. And if you're not psychologically prepared for that, it can trigger a very human response: sell everything and stop the bleeding. But here's the thing: the people who panicked and sold in 2008 or in March of 2020, locked in their losses and then missed the recovery, the people who stayed in or who didn't look came out the other side okay, and often better than before. This isn't to say you should put money in the market that you need next month. That's actually really important. Money you might need soon should not be in investments. It belongs somewhere stable, like a high-yield savings account. The money you invest should be money you genuinely don't need for years. Which brings up a question I want you to sit with. If you're starting from zero, does it even make sense to think about investing right now? And my honest answer is maybe not immediately, not in the way people usually mean. Here's the mindset shift I want to offer you, because I think it changes everything. Most people think of investing as something that comes after you have money. Like, once I've got everything sorted, once I've got a cushion, once I've figured out my income, then I'll start thinking about investing. And what happens? That moment never comes, because life keeps costing money and the threshold for feeling ready keeps moving. The reframe is this: building financial stability and beginning to invest aren't two separate phases. They're parallel practices. You don't have to have everything figured out to start. You just have to start with whatever the smallest meaningful step is for your situation. For someone in a really tight spot, that might genuinely be build an emergency fund first, even a small one. $1,000 in a savings account that you don't touch. Because investing without any financial buffer underneath you isn't building wealth, it's just gambling with money you might need. But once you have even a thin floor under you, the next step doesn't have to be huge. It can be $20 a month into a simple low-cost index fund. Not because $20 is going to make you rich, but because the habit of moving money in that direction consistently over time, that's the actual foundation. What I've found is that people think the breakthrough moment is when they finally have enough to really invest. But the real breakthrough is the first time you do it at all and realize the world didn't end. The process wasn't that confusing, and something small is now working for you in the background. There's also something psychological that happens when you start. You start paying attention differently. You start caring about what companies do, how the economy moves, what interest rates mean for your money. Not because you're obsessed, but because you have skin in the game. Even a small amount of skin changes your relationship to information. So what does this actually look like in practice? Let me walk through something realistic. If you're at zero right now, no savings, maybe some debt, the first real step isn't picking stocks or choosing a broker. It's getting a clear picture of what's actually happening with your money every month. Not in a scary way, just what's coming in, what's going out, and is there anything, even $5 or $10 a month, that isn't spoken for? If the answer is truly no, that's useful information. It means the work right now is on the income or expenses side, not the investing side. And that's okay. Knowing that is actually empowering, not defeating. If there is something, even a tiny something, the next step is opening a simple, low-fee brokerage account. Fidelity and Vanguard are two that are commonly recommended for people just starting out because their fees are low and they're not trying to push you into complicated products. There are others, but that gives you a starting point to look into. Once the account is open, the simplest move most people start with is putting money into a broad index fund, something that tracks the whole stock market, rather than picking individual companies. This spreads your risk across hundreds of companies, so you're not betting on any one of them. And then the real secret, which isn't a secret at all, it's just boring enough that nobody makes YouTube videos about it, is to keep doing that regularly, every month or every paycheck, automatically if possible. The automation matters because it removes the decision from the equation. You're not relying on motivation or timing the market. You're just consistently adding, consistently building, and letting time do what it does. That's the whole strategy. Not the most exciting thing I've ever described, but it's the one that actually works for most people. The other thing worth mentioning, if your job offers a 401k with any kind of employer match, that's worth paying attention to before anything else. A match is essentially free money being offered to you as part of your compensation. Even a small contribution to capture that match is almost always worth doing first. I want to end with something that I think gets lost in most of this conversation. You are not behind in some permanent, irreversible way. The feeling of being behind is real, and it makes sense given how much this stuff can feel like a secret language that everyone else got the decoder ring to. But being behind is a temporary position, not a fixed identity. The person who starts at 30 with nothing and adds a little every month for 30 years is not locked out. They're just working with a different timeline than someone who started at 22. The math still works. The growth still happens. The direction still matters. What doesn't work is staying frozen while waiting for the perfect moment, the perfect income, the perfect level of confidence. That moment has a way of never arriving. What does work is small, consistent action in the right direction. And knowing enough to take that first step, even imperfectly, is more than most people ever actually do. You watched this video. That's already something. That already counts. So take that small next step, open the account, put the $20 in, watch it sit there and do nothing for a while, and try to resist the urge to touch it. Let the boring thing be boring, because in 10 years, the boring thing will be the best financial decision you ever made.